Okay, so we're going to finish this reading. If we don't, we'll have to move on. If we finish it early, we'll stop. Let's just get going. So we're on page 28, Sutra 2. That's chapter 2, sorry. It's chapter 2, section 2, Sutra 7. Purusha Ashmavad iti chet tatapi. So the sutra, broadly translated, because you have to add some words in the sutra because they're very cryptic and succinct. So the sutra states, if your contention is, right, that a Purusha, so the opposing point of view, that a Purusha, remember the Purusha is the Atman, moves primordial matter like a magnet, similar problems remain. Okay, remember the magnet metaphor. Magnet doesn't do anything. Just by its very nature, I don't know what a physicist would say. I don't know what a magnetic field is, perhaps some kind of electric field. Some of you would know that better than me if you're studying physics, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't move. Just by its very nature, whatever that magnetic nature is, it causes, if there's iron filings in the vicinity, it causes the iron filings to move. So that's the metaphor. Okay, so Purusha doesn't have to do anything, because remember, Purusha can't do anything if it's eternal. That's an axiom of Sāṅkhya. Something is eternal, it can't do something, because something does something, it changes. Redoing, and then doing, and then post-doing, it's a different thing. Any kind of action, it has some kind of transformative effect, and if something transforms even a tiny bit, then it's not eternal. Eternal means never changing. So Śaṅkara goes, this too is wrong, as it's not free from flaws. Okay, this magnet metaphor, it's got problems, said Śaṅkara. What are the problems? First, in what you have just said, you abandon your own asserted thesis. Śaṅkara says, you're contradicting yourselves, your own thesis. Your core view, remember the your is Sāṅkhya, is that primordial matter is intrinsically active. Its nature is to be active. It's intrinsic. Its essence is action. While the conscious self, the Purusha, also known as Atman, does not initiate activity. It's just consciousness, passively emits consciousness. And so to take up your new position, Śaṅkara says, now you've just reinvented yourself. You're coming up with a new position. What's the new position? How is it that the conscious self, who is fundamentally indifferent means pure consciousness, he's detached, has no attachment to anything, indifferent to everything, absorbed in its own nature, is fundamental to it. It's just pure passive awareness. So according to Sāṅkhya, and Advaita, Śaṅkara would agree in his own way with some of that. So that the self, it was fundamentally indifferent, makes primordial matter act. Right, so now let me just introduce the Sāṅkhya metaphor. Sāṅkhya says it's like a blind man, that's Prakriti, and a lame man, Purusha, meaning that Purusha in its own nature can do nothing. It's just pure consciousness. So it's like a cripple, but it can see. Prakriti is like a blind person. Can't see, but it's got good legs. It can move. So in the Sāṅkhya metaphor, the crippled person gets on the back. The blind person gives a piggyback to the crippled person. Now, the blind person can't see, but's got legs. It can walk. Crippled person sitting on top now. Broken legs, can't walk, but it can see. So it can direct the blind Prakriti. It can say, go here, go there. So the crippled person sitting on the shoulders of the blind person, the crippled person who has good eyesight, can direct the blind person that the cripple is sitting on, blind person being strong with good legs. So that's the metaphor that Sāṅkhya introduces at the end of the Sāṅkhya Karikas, the text central to Sāṅkhya. Now, where are we? For even the crippled person uses speech and physical contact to make the blind man move. Śaṅkara is saying that your metaphor doesn't work, because the crippled person may be sitting on the shoulders of the blind person, but he still has to direct, just to say, go straight, go left, watch out for the lamppost, make a right. So he still has to be active. Whereas, so the metaphor doesn't work for Sāṅkhya, says Śaṅkara, because really that metaphor is supposed to represent a Purusha that doesn't direct Prakriti. It's pure consciousness. It has no mental activity, no will, no intelligence, no anything until it gets the instruments of the subtle body and the gross body. So he's saying even the crippled person uses speech and physical contact to make the blind man move. So the crippled person isn't completely inactive. Nor could it do this in the fashion of a magnet. Okay, so the second metaphor is the magnet, which works merely by proximity. A magnet works just by, all you got to do is bring it close to the iron filings, doesn't touch them, doesn't do anything, but it just, as a result of proximity, it causes the iron filings to move. I don't know if you've gone to those when you were young. You went to the kiddie museums. I know when my daughter was young in San Francisco, they had a kiddie museum, and she loved to play with the magnets. And there was a big pile of filings, and you could make these really cool shapes. They would all cling onto the magnets. So, but the magnet wouldn't actually do anything. I mean, you would have to bring it near, proximity. Since the proximity would always be in place, Śaṅkara says the problem with that idea is, who brings them together? And if no one's, because they don't accept Ishvara Sāṅkhya, Śaṅkara's going to say, okay, we'll go with we'll accept that metaphor as long as you introduce Ishvara, who brings the magnet and the filings together. If you don't have an entity bring them together, how do they get together then? They would always be in proximity. So the proximity would always be in place. No one's bringing them together, so it's always there then. The conscious self is always in the vicinity of matter. Initiation of action would always occur, so it would always be action. So that this is the difficulty. So there wouldn't be creative cycles. There wouldn't be there. Remember, most Hindu traditions say there's creation, it lasts for a certain period of time, dissolution, and there's a period of inaction between creation. This is the difficulty, says Śaṅkara. They would always be together. And then there'd be no liberation. Maybe he's going to add that later. If Purusha is always in the vicinity of Prakriti and always agitating Prakriti, how would there be liberation for Purusha then? That requires detachment. A magnet is not, in contrast, always in proximity to the bits of iron whose movement it can cause. Śaṅkara says in real world, magnet's not always next to iron filings. When it is close, it functions on its own. Fair enough. But someone has to bring them together. Furthermore, its working is conditioned by such factors as having been wiped clean. Not a very good argument, but he's going to say anyway, you have to have other ingredients as well, like you have to wipe it clean, otherwise it loses its magnetic power. What he should have said there is, what I thought he was going to say is, somebody has to bring them close together. Thus, your claim that a Purusha moves primordial matter, right? Remember, Sāṅkhya doesn't want Ishvara. We don't need an Ishvara to initiate creation. Just Purusha's proximity to Prakriti causes Prakriti to agitate, and Prakriti then initiates creation, just like a magnet causes iron filings to move. That's Sāṅkhya's argument, and Śaṅkara is poking holes in the metaphor. He's saying the metaphor doesn't even work for you. So your claim that a Purusha moves primordial matter like a magnet remains unproven. Vachaspati steps in, as you know, secondary commentator after Śaṅkara. Vachaspati Mishra says, the Sāṅkhya advocate argues, okay, the Purva Paksha Sāṅkhya. Let us not suppose, right, he's representing Sāṅkhya, right? He's going to be the spokesperson. He's going to say, I'm going to represent your argument, Sāṅkhya. Let us not suppose that the initiating factor of creation is the conscious self's purposes, nor some inherent purposefulness of the forces. Right? Let's drop that argument. He says that was previously, but remember the previous section, there has to be purpose for creation, but Prakriti has no purpose because it's not intelligent. Purusha has no purpose because it's detached. So where's purpose come into it? Rather, let the conscious self, endowed with awareness force, such chit, awareness, I don't know why he puts force, just awareness, but awareness force, okay. As a crippled person initiates action on the part of a blind person, crippled, on the shoulders, blind person initiates action, says, okay, you can't see, but I can direct you from up here, walk straight. But the view cannot rid itself of defects, says Vachaspati. As Śaṅkara says, you abandoned your accepted thesis. You by using this example, you're going against your own thesis, you Sāṅkhya people. Not only would Sāṅkhya here abandon an accepted thesis, but this claim is also inconsistent with their own philosophical framework. Thus, Śaṅkara says, How is it that the conscious self is fundamentally indifferent? Okay, cripple is not a good metaphor for the Purusha, because the cripple might be crippled, can't move, but he can direct. He can. The metaphor requires that the cripple on the shoulders direct with intelligence. Go here, go here. Purusha doesn't direct. It's just pure consciousness. So the metaphor goes against Sāṅkhya's own thesis. Okay. And then, and for what I thought they were going to say, what they could have said, and what we can add to this, is it needs a person to bring. Even let's go with the magnet metaphor, but somebody has to get the magnet and push it towards the iron filings. Because if it was already in the beginning in proximity, there would always be creation. There'd be no liberation, which goes against Sāṅkhya's view, and there'd be no end to the creative cycle. Remember, there's the creation in most Hindu schools, except one or two, except Mimamsa. Creation, and then a period, and then annihilation. Śaṅkara, in summary, for the reasons that, now he's going to list the reasons, okay? 1, primordial, so he's going to give us a nice little review. Let's go with it. 1, primordial matter is insentient, can't do anything by itself. 2, the pure conscious self is indifferent, doesn't want to do anything, doesn't know willpower, it's not going to direct anything, it's not going to, it's not going to trigger Prakriti, it's just an indifferent monad of pure consciousness. Pure conscious self is indifferent. 3, there is no third thing that could cause the two to be related. Vedanta says there is, Ishvara, but Sāṅkhya says no, there's no third thing. Vedanta wants to pick holes in the notion that there's only Purusha and Prakriti. Accepts Purusha and Prakriti. Vedanta accepts Purusha and Prakriti. I hope that's clear. But they say there has to be a third thing, Ishvara. And they're attacking Sāṅkhya not because of their belief in Purusha and Prakriti. That everybody accepts. But they're attacking it because Sāṅkhya does not recognize a third thing. We know what the third thing is, Ishvara. But Sāṅkhya says, there is, furthermore, okay, there's no third thing that could cause the two to be related, no third thing to push them together. There is no possibility of the relation between primordial matter and the conscious self. They would never be related unless a third thing brought them together. Furthermore, considering your thesis, Sāṅkhya, that the relation arises through an affinity, Sāṅkhya says the relationship between the two, don't need a third person, it arises through an affinity between the two. But if that's the case, then since this affinity is not subject to destruction, if you say it's just an affinity of the two when they come together, when they are together, but then there would always be that affinity. There will always be creation and no liberation. Since the affinity is not subject to destruction, what's going to destroy that affinity if it's inherent to both? Your view faces again the difficulty that liberation would not be possible. Could never be liberated because the affinity, if Sāṅkhya wants to say that a Purusha has an affinity and Prakriti has an affinity, when they come together, the affinities combine and cause creation. If that's the case, well, those two affinities being inherent would always be affinities, and they will always be together, and they would always be triggering creation. Atman would always be embodied, there'd be no liberation. But Sāṅkhya says there is liberation. So Śaṅkara is trying to show your own thesis is incoherent. It doesn't even fit your own philosophy. It doesn't even support your own belief systems. And so, just like earlier, you would have to maintain that there is no purpose on the part of primordial matter. In contrast, right? In contrast, as conceived by us, he's saying now, we don't have the problems you have. If you accept our view, the Supreme Self, Ishvara, of course, is about Ishvara. The Supreme Self is, by its self-supporting intrinsic nature, it's the nature of Ishvara, it's both indifferent to activity and an instigator of activity, can do both. It itself, Ishvara doesn't need to do anything fully complete, but nonetheless initiates activity so as to allow the living entities to be free, pursue their free will, and therefore that triggers activity. Hence the superiority of our view to that of Sāṅkhya. Okay, so Śaṅkara says our view is better than yours. We don't have that problem. But you see the argument. It's a fair argument. What brings the two together? And if you're going to say they're always together, then there's no liberation. But Sāṅkhya says there is liberation. So it's a problem. Of course, Śaṅkara has his own problem. Accounting for what is illusion. If everything's illusion, well, what is that illusion? Right, let's Go to the next one. 228, top of page 30. Furthermore, subordination of one mode to another is impossible, right? Prakriti before creation, 3 gunas. And in order for there to be creation, one of the gunas, rajas, which is the action guna, needs to be dominant. It needs to push its way forward and instigate energy and action. And that's kind of like churning the milk, churning Prakriti, and then the universe evolves out of it like a big bang. I don't think Sāṅkhya would have a particularly big, would necessarily oppose Big Bang theory. Actually, they probably have their own flavors to it. But in principle, they wouldn't have a problem that all matter comes from some original unitary entity. They would just say it's the 3 gunas, Prakriti. But so there may be differences. I'm not saying it's identical, but in principle, they wouldn't have major philosophical problems with Big Bang theory. Śaṅkara. And from this, it follows that one shouldn't think that primordial matter acts at all. I keep talking about Big Bang because this is ancient physics. Sāṅkhya is ancient physics. And so if we're trying to create conversations with modern physics, and I hope some of you will do that, my friends, because I don't know anything about modern physics. But some of you, I'm sure, are being trained in our modern sciences. And if you have some respect for these philosophical traditions and you feel they have some value, well, they're only going to be valuable if they're brought into dialogue with our modern moment. So it's up to you this book was written by Dusty. He was sitting right where you're sitting. He was a student at Rutgers, an undergraduate. I remember him 20 years ago. Now we're friends, he and I. And he got inspired by Indian philosophy. Now he's a professor and he's teaching Indian philosophy. It's not impossible. I don't think, if you want to pursue this more deeply, and if some of you have science backgrounds, it'd be a great service to the Indian traditions, to modern science, to create these points of conversation. People are doing it increasingly. That needs a lot more. Right. And from this, it follows that one shouldn't think that primordial matter acts at all. For such would require primordial matter with its uniform essential nature to cast away the fundamental balance amongst the modes. That why would, if the modes are all in equilibrium, what would upset them so that creation starts? If it's the fundamental, so he's saying there wouldn't be any creation at all. If you say that in the beginning, right, there was just there was just this uniform equilibrium between the modes, what would upset it? It would just remain in that state if that's its nature to be in that state. In that state, the 3 gunas have intrinsic natures independently of one another. Rajas is action, tamas is stillness. So actually what happens in that point of equilibrium between the creative cycles, tamas is suppressing the rajasic potential of rajas. Rajas wants to agitate and sponsor and initiate and trigger creation, and tamas, it neutralizes that. One commentator, a modern one, said it's like standing on a bed spring. You stand on it, the bed spring wants to spring, but you're standing on it and you're suppressing that inherent potential of the bed spring, which is to spring. And supper is doing its own thing, but so therefore you have this sort of equitension. It's tension between the tamas and rajas especially, and it's equal. The tension is precisely right, so that the rajasic inclination to act is precisely counteracted by the tamasic inclination to suppress. So it's perfect equitension. You get that tension creature equilibrium. So Śaṅkara says, it's unacceptable that one would become subordinate to any of the others because they would all lose their intrinsic nature. What would make one dominant? What would make rajas dominate? Its nature is to be dominant, but tamas nature is to suppress. So the two are counteracting each other. They're neutralizing each other. What would cause that imbalance? Important point. It's like saying, what would trigger the Big Bang? If that potential to explode was whatever that first moment was, maybe an infinitely dense particle. I don't know, but you will know better than me. But let's just say an infinitely dense particle and its nature was at some point to explode. Well, why didn't it would always explode if that's its nature? The sun's nature is to shine. It always shines. It doesn't sort of all of a sudden start shining at a particular moment in time. It is unexpectable that one would become subordinate to any others, because then they would lose their intrinsic nature. If Rajas emerges superior, then Tamas has lost its part of its intrinsic nature to counteract it. Since on the Sāṅkhya view, nothing external exists that could agitate them, Danta's going to say Ishvara external to the three agitates it, so you get an outside entity triggers the beginning of it all, kickstarts Rajas into action. But Sāṅkhya doesn't accept an external entity. Wherever it says an external agent, that means Ishvara. Okay, they would say the same for Big Bang. What made it bang? There needs to be a God that triggers that, whatever it was, that first moment. So, since on the Sāṅkhya view nothing external exists that could agitate them, there would be no creation of the great, of Mahat, of all the evolutes of Prakriti that end up with the trees and mountains and oceans and universes that we see, made of particles and forces. They would accept the notion of particles and forces being the external, the perceivable level of reality. They would accept the idea that that's held together, but their particles are held together by forces. They would say something quite similar to that, not identical, but similar enough to make it interesting. There would be no creation, and the rest of the items of Sāṅkhya theory, there would be no creation, which are said to be caused by non-equilibrium among the modes, right? Creation requires non-equilibrium, meaning Rajas gets dominant, there's no more equilibrium, nothing happens. When Rajas pushes its way forward, breaks the equilibrium, then you have creation. Vachaspati. Had the state of primordial matter been immutably eternal, if the primordial matter was always unchangeable eternally, then no change or deviation would be possible. If original matter, it was inherent, its nature was to be immutable, unchangeable, there'd be no creation, it would remain unchangeable. For accepting that the primordial state could change would lead Sāṅkhya to the undesirable position that the primordial state would be non-eternal. If Prakriti can change, then Prakriti is not eternal, because anything that changes is not eternal. This is an axiom of Sāṅkhya philosophy. Something is eternal, it can't change. I gave the example of milk. If milk churns, it turns into butter or ghee or dahi or yogurt. It's not milk anymore. Milk goes to yogurt, then there's not milk anymore. It's yogurt now. So you can't say milk was eternal. If you want milk to be eternal, it can never change. Always has to be in the state of milk. Can't curdle, can't go, can't transform into, to anything. So that's an axiom. So then, so he's attacking Sāṅkhya. And he quotes a verse. It is rightly said, the wise accept that the nature or essence, the svabhava, that never deviates from its original state is eternal. What is an eternal entity? Something that never deviates from its original state. Always remains in that state. So then we can say it's eternally in that state, ongoingly in that state. That's the word sat. Sat, Chidananda, sat means being, always in the state of being. That is why Śaṅkara says then they would lose their intrinsic nature. He says if you're going to say Prakriti is eternal, then it can't change. How can it change into creation? Now he goes, well, okay, what if you say an objector may ask? Well, an objector may respond and say this. What if, says the objector, okay, it says, what if the primordial state is mutably eternal? That it's eternal, but eternally mutating, eternally changing. What if we say that then? So the objector says, okay, we get the point. If something is eternal, it doesn't change. But what if it's eternally changing? Ah, ha, ha, ha. What are you going to say about that? Says the objector, right? And the objector continues. It has been said. Now the objector quotes a verse. The eternal is that which undergoes changes while its essence remains the same. So the qualities may change, but the essence doesn't change. So that is another way of thinking of eternality, something the essence of it doesn't change, but the qualities change. So I don't know what a good example would be. Maybe the sun doesn't change, but the light changes. That doesn't quite work, but he's saying, what if we accept only the essence is unchanging? So the essence of the property is eternal, but its qualities change. Okay. In response to this, Śaṅkara responds, since nothing external exists, there's nothing outside, no Ishvara for Sāṅkhya, how is it that something that maintained a state of equilibrium for a long time could start changing in the absence of an external factor? Remember, Sāṅkhya also accepts creation lasts 14 billion years. Then everything involutes. Everything goes back to like back to that dense, back to a sort of pre-Big Bang. Back to that, all prakriti, everything dissolves into and ultimately the three gunas. And it remains like in that state of equilibrium. The gunas are equilibrium. And use the word equitension. Rajas's desire to create is being suppressed for 14 billion years. But then why after 14 billion years? What changes then? What triggers it to create again? Because creation is cyclical. It's eternally cyclical. 14 billion years creation, 14 billion years latency, 14 billion years creation, and on for infinity. So, but what creates that what disturbs the equilibrium after 14 billion years? How is it that something that maintained the state of equilibrium for a long time could start changing in the absence of an external factor? And if an independent entity somehow starts changing spontaneously, it's not supposed to maintain an equilibrium. If it can do that, if it can spontaneously change, then there was never an equilibrium to begin with. Maybe it was 49.9% versus 50 point whatever, 1. And it seems equilibrium, but 1 point, at a certain moment, that one little point extra tips the balance and boom. So it was never equilibrium in the first place. That's what he's saying. But of course, Sāṅkhya says there was equilibrium in the first place. Moving over to page 31. Right? Attacking Sāṅkhya all the way. Moreover, the defects remain. They continue hammering poor old Sāṅkhya. The defects remain. If you make a different inference, since primordial matter is divorced from the power of consciousness. So now they're going to take on a different argument. Let's see what this one is. So the objector says, maybe, right, your previous points, maybe. He's not willing to say, yes, okay, we accept you. Maybe. A little bit of ego there. Maybe, I'll think about it. Maybe. But we make a different inference, says the objector, that does not have the defect you have now brought out. Oh, you haven't represented us properly. That's not quite what we say. We say this, but we do not accept that the modes each have intrinsic natures independently and are unaffected. And there's no evidence to support such a view. He's saying we don't accept that this equilibrium you're talking about between the modes. Rather, the intrinsic nature of the modes is identified according to the nature of the effect one wants to explain. You understand the nature of the modes from the effects that come out of them. So if fire comes out of it, when we have fire, you know Rajas is dominant. When we have metal, you know Tamas is dominant. So the effects tell us something. Air and light, we know Sattva is dominant. So we know something about the relationship of the modes from the effects. It's not a very good argument. It doesn't seem to be addressing the point. Remember, it's not Sāṅkhya's argument. Śaṅkara is saying this is what Sāṅkhya. Usually they represent the arguments very well, but sometimes they create this random argument that's not very fair, that's not necessarily representing the point of view of the opponent. But for the most part, it is honest and intellectually vigorous, and that really contributes to the richness and the open-mindedness and the non-dogmatic nature of intellectual thought in ancient India. It always engaged opponents. It never just stayed trapped in a box, never just pushed them away and says, oh, we don't want to talk to you. You don't follow the Vedas, or we're not going to talk to you. Never. Always engaging. That's what intellectuality it is. It's always probing its own positions to some extent, but certainly engaging opposing points of view. This is the principle. So still the opposing point of view, Sāṅkhya. We can conceive of things' intrinsic nature according to our understanding of the effects that they produce. So this has, it's an effect. So we understand its intrinsic nature. It has a lot more tamas than it has sattva. And it is accepted that restlessness, instability is a property of the modes. So the property, especially of rajas, is this restlessness. And so that restlessness causes creation. Therefore, even in the state of primordial equilibrium, the modes are capable of entering into disequilibrium. This is how they are. So Śaṅkara has already rejected this argument. But again, they say, okay, so he's saying that Samkhya says that even in equilibrium, at some point, the nature of rajas is just going to happen. It don't need an Ishvara. And it just of its own accord, it's going to trigger creation. Śaṅkara says, and he says, I've already discussed this, and he has. In which case, why does he introduce the objection? He's introducing it, and not Sāṅkhya. Śaṅkara, even so, all the defects mentioned earlier, starting with problems involving world arrangement, beset your idea of that very state. Since primordial matter is divorced from the power of consciousness, you could never argue that it has the power of consciousness, as that would contradict your basic position. You're saying you still haven't explained what causes that, even if it's the nature of rajas, to be restless, to initiate creation. You haven't explained what triggers it. And you're not willing to bring in consciousness and external conscious entity. The notion that there is a unitary conscious being who is the underlying cause of this world's display of multiplicity is the result of thinking like the Vedanta. You don't accept a conscious being, a supreme being. We're talking about being that triggers the whole of creation. Not you and I, we're little beings. We can maybe initiate motion in our little bodies. You're not talking about that. We're talking about creation, the big with a big C. That being, right, is, Śaṅkara says you don't accept it. So, but if you do, the notion that there is a unitary conscious being, he says, who is the underlying cause of this world's display of multiplicity, Brahman, is the result of thinking like a Vedantin. That's how we think, he says. You don't say that, but if you did, you'd be like, then we have no argument with you. You'd be thinking like us. You'd be thinking like a Vedantin, a proponent of Brahman, in which case you surrender your view, in which case you've given up your view and we defeated you and welcome into our camp. Pat on the back. Well done. Although you say the Gunas are capable of entering into disequilibrium, continues Śaṅkara against Sāṅkhya, when they, back to the same point, when they are in a state of balance, they would never do so. There would be no reason for it. What would cause the equilibrium of the three modes, the three Gunas, what would cause them to be disrupted? If you don't accept an outside agent who comes along and initiates a disruption. Problem. It's a good point. Or if they did break up and diverge, you said, oh, even if they did, they would constantly do so. If it's their nature to break up and diverge, then they'd always be doing so, in which case there'll be no liberation and no period between the creation, which Sāṅkhya says there is. So there would be, this is the inevitable difficulty. The defect remains for your view. I got to keep an eye on the clock because I want to respect our, I'm doing this, not that I want to. I love to read this stuff, but I just got to keep an eye on. Sometimes I get into the zone and forget about time. Now, 2.2.10. Furthermore, okay, that's kind of irrelevant. Let's go over the page. He basically in 2.2.10, you should read it, just saying, and anyway, your Sāṅkhya are contradictory. So, sometimes you say your own account of creation is contradictory, because there were many different Sāṅkhya traditions, and some enumerated the various evolutes from Prakriti, forces, matter, intelligence, ego. These are different things that come out of Prakriti, and they different schools enumerate them differently, but that's probably not fair because there were different Vedanta schools. So Sāṅkhya could just turn around and say, well, you lot have differences too. So 2.210 is not it's not a philosophical argument. It's just saying, well, you lot contradict yourselves. You say different things. So let's go to the next part. 33, objection. This is kind of a little bit long and complicated, but since we're not going to start Ramanuja today, let's just read it, see how we do. It is rather this is Indian philosophy, my friends. You read sutras and then you read the commentaries. This is the traditional way of engaging intellectual thought in ancient India. Takes a little bit of adjusting too. I hope you're following along. I hope you're enjoying it, or at least, you know, I hope you're slowly getting adjusted to it, and you know, don't resist it just because it's different. We all step out of the box and encounter these are extremely intelligent thinkers. Let's be clear about that. Sure, they didn't have microscopes and all the gadgetry we did, but they're extremely intelligent. So let's try to follow the way they reason. You know, it's different from ours, but surely that's what makes us, enriches us as intellectual beings when we step out of our box and try to sort of see the world through the lenses and the thought processes of others, my friends. Okay, so come along for the ride. So now the opponent says, well, wait a minute, you say we're incoherent. It is rather the philosophy of the Vedantins that is utterly contradictory, says the Samkhya opponent, because you do not accept that the subject who suffers is a distinct type of thing from that which causes suffering. Now remember Advaita Vedanta. It's only Brahman. World is false. Souls are ultimately one with Brahman. So there's only one. So the Sāṅkhya says, okay, and actually, I kind of agree with Sāṅkhya here. So in your view, there's no differences. So therefore, the sufferer and the cause of suffering is the same. Let's see where it goes with this. Because you do not accept that the subject who suffers is a distinct type of thing from that which causes suffering. The body, the world, causes suffering. 4. In accepting Brahman as unitary, remember Śaṅkara does, Ramanuja, no, he doesn't. He says there's differences. So this is only an argument against Advaita Vedanta, not against other schools of Vedanta. So for in accepting Brahman as unitary, as both the self of everyone and the cause of all manifestation, you say, you know, Brahman is remember the second sutra of the Brahma Sutra? What is Brahman? Janmadhyasya yataha. Make sure you know that for your quiz, my friends. Brahman is that from which maintenance and the creation, maintenance, and dissolution of the universe emanate. So in accepting Brahman, okay, accepting Brahman as unitary, as both the self of everyone and the cause of all manifestation, the creator, you must identify the two qualities. So you're saying it's all the same thing. Being the sufferer and being the cause of suffering as belonging to a unitary self. Sāṅkhya wants to say that's incoherent to say that you're the sufferer and the cause of suffering. This precludes you from accepting the two as distinct kinds, whereas such dualism is the hallmark of our view. Sāṅkhya says there's duality: the sufferer, Atman, and the world, the cause of suffering. You Advaita Vedantins, he doesn't say Advaita, but you say it's all just one. It's all Brahman. So suffering and the sufferer are the same thing. And if you think that being the sufferer and being the cause of suffering both belong to a single self, then the self could never be liberated, because it would always be the sufferer and the cause of suffering. How would it be liberated? Vedantic texts would thus be wrong in teaching that having the right philosophy quenches the fire of suffering. Vedanta says with knowledge, you can become liberated and be free of suffering. For a lamp, whose nature is to emit heat and light, doesn't lose that nature in the act of emitting them. So the nature of a lamp is to emit heat and light, and it never loses that. So if the nature of the self is to be the sufferer and the cause of suffering, it would always be a sufferer and a cause of suffering. It would never be liberated. I don't know how good of an argument it is, but it's a good overall argument against the incoherence of Advaita, in the sense of there's no distinction between anything, between Brahman or Atman of the world, in the ultimate, the highest frame of reference. You might portray the self by analogy with water, where disturbances of the sea in the form of waves and foam are simply the ever-arising and disappearing modes of the water, which itself is a unified thing. In that case, however, water could never be free of waves and foam. So one of the Advaita metaphors is to explain apparent duality, because it seems that I'm sitting here and the world is out there and you're sitting wherever you are, but normally in the classroom. It seems, remember, that's all an illusion for Advaita Vedanta. They say it's like water which has foams and bubbles on the top, and it seems like they're different from the water, but they're really not. And they just dissolve back into the water. So then the opponent says, well, then water would always have waves and foam. So Brahman would always be the sufferer and the cause of suffering. There would be no liberation. It's the same argument continued. Furthermore, according to common understanding, a sufferer and the causes of suffering are different sorts of things. For example, a person seeking something and the object sought are to be characterized as mutually distinct, right? If I seek something and the thing I seek, there's a duality there. So the sufferer and the cause of suffering, there must be two distinct things. If the object sought did not differ from the seeker herself, then whatever object would make her a seeker would always remain in her possession. Then if there is no difference between the seeker and the object, you're saying that they're one, then the seeker and the object are one, then the seeker would be always seeking something that but actually is within it. I mean, it's incoherent, is what Sāṅkhya is trying to say. You can't make sense of, you can't even conceptually make sense of a seeker seeking something that's inherent within it. Thus, there could be nothing that would make her a seeker. How would she be a seeker in the first place if the object was non-different from her, the object of being sought? Sounds like Nagarjuna, the Buddhist. For it takes something that is not possessed to make it possible that there be something that is sought by a seeker. So for there to be a seeker, it has to seek something distinct from itself, right? So there has to be duality. That's what Sāṅkhya wants to say. None of this makes any sense within an Advaita metaphysics from a Sāṅkhya point of view, which only accepts one Brahman. So how do you understand seeker and sought? And so how would a seeker seek liberation, for that matter? Okay. Similarly, nothing would be sought out as a desired object if you wouldn't seek anything if you accept Advaita Vedanta, because everything would be already in the unified Brahman. If non-dualism were true, Advaita, then the desired object would already belong to itself. There'd be no duality, no difference between object and subject, desired object and a desirer of the object or seeker of the object. So he's going on at the same point. And that does not happen. He's saying that's ridiculous. So that we don't see that in the real world. But there are two relational words with distinct meanings, seeker and sought. They relate to each other, but they're distinct. The seeker seeks, and then the object of seeking, desired object. And the relation implied would be between two relata, not a single thing, two distinct things. Therefore, these two, seeker and sought, are distinct realities. There must be dualism. It's where Sāṅkhya wants to end up. Likewise, that which is not sought and the non-seeker are distinct realities. If you don't seek something, and then there's a non-seeker, because there's nothing that's being sought, but they're still distinct. There's an object that's not sought. And so there's a seeker, there's not a seeker that seeks those objects, but you still have duality. The desirable is something the seeker favors. The undesirable is something the seeker does not favor. So even if it's something that's not sought, but you still have to have a potential seeker that doesn't seek it, still have two, right? I don't really seek to get up and go over there right now, but they're still there, and there's still the me that doesn't want to do that. So there's still two different things, different sorts of entities. A single person becomes related to each in due course. Because that which is desired may become diminished and that which is undesirable expanded, the two are both really undesirable. They're both the causes of suffering. Now he gets into a different point that, whether if you desire something, you obtain it, then after a while it diminishes, you lose it, or you lose interest in it, or the two that which is desired may become diminished, and that which is and then you seek to avoid undesirable, but that increases. So both the desirable and the undesirable are causes of suffering. This is just a psychological point, and everybody accepts that the objects of desire cause suffering. So you have the desirable and the undesirable. Well, even if you attain a desirable thing, it diminishes, like money or relationships or whatever. They evaporate in time, or you get old. undesirable things can increase. So they're both ultimately causes of suffering. So that's a different point. It's nothing to do with the arguments I had previously. So I don't know why they're here. It just throws that in. It comes back to the point. In contrast, that which suffers is the conscious self, who is a single being, becomes related to the two, the sought and the not sought in due course. So he's saying the seeker is distinct from whether something sought, an object of desire, or an undesirable thing. It doesn't matter. There is a separate entity that has a relationship with both. Seeks the good, tries to avoid the bad, tries to fulfill desires, avoid negative things, but there has to be a separate entity to engage in that relationship with these two things. Thus, liberation would not be possible if the two, the sufferer and the causes of suffering, have a single nature. Now it comes back to the point. If the sufferer and the causes of suffering were one and the same thing, so the sufferer would always be a sufferer and would always have causes of suffering inherent within it. So where would be liberation? That would just be the eternal state of that entity, which is rather miserable thought. But if there are two kinds of things, there is the Atman, Purusha, and Prakriti. There is the Atman, and then the objects of desire, which is Prakriti, creation, creates all these objects of desire. If the two kinds of things, then liberation can occur, because you can, become attached to Prakriti and then realize you're suffering and then become detached because you're separate from Prakriti. You can realize your mistake and say, oh, I was seeking happiness in the world of matter through my body and senses, through sense objects, through things out there, right? Through taste and sound and the ears, I was trying to find happiness, but I kept finding frustration instead. So let me give it up and seek liberation. So you can do that if they're two different things, the seeker and the object sought. But if they are two of different kinds, liberation does come about sometimes, specifically by removing the cause of conjunction. And that's something we'll run into. Yoga, the cause of conjunction is ignorance. The Atman ignorantly thinks, I am this body-mind. I can find happiness through my body-mind. I can find happiness in the objects of the world. That's ignorance. And so we run around trying to find happiness in the objects of the world. We're trying to find our soulmates, our partners, want to have families and kids and get a good job and enjoy life and go to the beach and go to the movies. And these traditions will say, you'll still be miserable. You'll never find happiness that way because these things are temporary. They don't last. So, Śaṅkara, you're wrong. So all of that was Sāṅkhya. Trying to say there has to be two, dualism. Remember? Śaṅkara is Advaita, non-dual. You're wrong. Says Śaṅkara, you're wrong. Well, let's have an argument, Śaṅkara. Okay, here's the argument. Because of the self's unity, no relation between sufferer and causes of suffering can be understood to apply. He says there's no sufferer and suffering, there's only unity. Remember, he says the notion of distinction is Maya, ignorance, but he doesn't explain the origin of ignorance. So he's just pushes the problem back a level. Our view would be, Advaita, Śaṅkara says about Advaita, our view would have the defect you allege. He said you would be right if, being unified, the sufferer and the causes of suffering were understood to share mutually the relationship of subject and object. If we say everything's unified, and if there were a sufferer and objects of suffering, then that would be contradictory with Advaita, which is a unity. The sufferer and objects of suffering, a duality. Said, so you would be right. Then he's going to go on to say, but really there's no suffering, no sources of suffering. It's just like the mirage. It's all an illusion. Okay, which begs the question, well, what's illusion? But this is not the case with the self, precisely because of its unity. There aren't two things within it. Vachaspati explains this better, so if you're getting a little bit frustrated, hang on for a minute, and we'll get to Vachaspati. For it's not the case that fire, which exists in a single thing, burns itself. Fire doesn't burn itself. There's only one thing. So the sufferer doesn't suffer. This sufferer and the causes of suffering are not one and the same thing. Right, let's go to Vachaspati. He explains this better. He helps Śaṅkara out here, I think. Śaṅkara says, you are wrong. Because of the self's unity, no relation of sufferer and causes of suffering can be understood to apply. There are no two things. But why? Can't just state that. You've got to argue for it. What's the argument for it? not dogmatic. You don't just say something. You got to argue for it. What's the argument? Since their identity would fail to account for the sufferer and the causes of suffering. Okay, here it is. Here's classic Advaita Vedanta, my friends. Get your yellow highlighters. This is it. We accept that at the level of everyday speech and action, presupposing avidya, spiritual ignorance, the sufferer is different from the causes of suffering. In conventional reality, it seems that the sufferer and the causes of suffering are, there's a world out there. I'm a seeker. I try to find happiness out there. There's duality. I fail. I am always frustrated. I get old. Eventually, I start dying. I've never found my bliss. I never found my right. So if the world was real, that would be true. He says, but that's only conventional reality, like the reality in the mirage. We're getting back to the old Advaita presuppositions here. Repeatedly, we have said, and I have said in this class. Now we get classic Advaita. Repeatedly, we have said that suffering itself is phenomenally, but not transcendentally real. It's conventionally real, a phenomenon on the phenomenological level as a phenomenon. So it's phenomenally real, but transcendentally, the higher ultimate Brahman, there's no duality. So remember, there's two tiers of Brahman. In Advaita, there's conventional, which is the result of ignorance and illusion, like a mirage. But the ultimate is everything is one. In this mirage and the illusion, it seems that there's duality and sufferer and causes of suffering, soul and the world, right? Because sufferer, causes of suffering is really, it's really a placeholder for Atman and Prakriti. Prakriti is the source of suffering. Atman is the sufferer. Okay? So we're really talking about Purusha and Prakriti when we use the language of sufferer and causes of suffering. They're only phenomenally real. They appear as phenomenon. Like a mirage appears to be an oasis. It's a phenomenon. You see it as a phenomenon, but it is not real. Reality is just sand in the desert. So this world appears real phenomenally, but in reality, sarvamidam kalu Brahman, it's all Brahman. So, so that's it. Now we're going to skip over the next page because too much. I'm not going to get much mileage out of it. And we have a good 40 minutes left. I don't think we're going to use all that time. Let me see. So, where were we? Okay. So we're going to skip that. Skip that. Oh, we're going to have a short class, my friends, because we're almost done, because I don't want to go through page 35, because I don't think we'll get much out of that. We've already got the main points. And we'll go to the bottom of page 36. And then we're going to have a short class, which means we'll have a longer class for Ramanuja. So we'll add whatever's missing. We'll see what, right now we'll probably get to 60 minutes. So we'll add another 20 minutes to the next class. The next class will be an hour and 40 minutes. We'll still have, we're supposed to have 2 hours and 40 minutes, right, of class. So if we finish this in an hour, we'll have an hour and 40 minutes for the next Ramanuja. Okay, I think it'll be easier. Ramanuja will be a bit easier if you're finding this difficulty. 36, Vachaspati, bottom of the page. Śaṅkara shows that on our view, the theory of liberation makes perfect sense when he says, on our Upanishadic view, remember Vedanta considers itself Upanishadic, an unblemished face can look different from its reflected image, which appears unclean and dark due to the mirror being unclean. So I have my face, it's clear and nice and clean, but let's say you have one of those warped mirrors and it's dusty and unclean, then the reflection of my face is going to appear distorted. But that's illusory. My actual face isn't. That's another example they want to give for the mirage. We had the mirage in the desert. Here's another one. The reflected face appears distorted if the medium of reflection is distorted. So, okay. So therefore, that's another example. In such a case, the unclean surface of the mirror would be a projected attribute. It would be superimposing dirt. The dirt is actually on the mirror, not in the face. But the mirror is superimposing, like the mirage is superimposed on the desert. It's just another metaphor to try to explain how it is that we're in ignorance and think we're the body minds. Consciousness is being reflected in avidya, in Maya. Now, when you ask an Advaitian what is Maya, then that's where Śaṅkara, later Advaita says anirvachaniya, or Śaṅkara says anirvachaniya. We can't understand what it is. It can't be something separate from Brahman because there's non-duality. It can't be in Brahman because Brahman is pure. There's no ignorance. So what's its location? Where does it? And Brahmanuja opens up his critique of Śaṅkara in the Vedanta Sutra. Kasya avidya? Where are you going to locate avidya? Without creating a duality between Brahman and avidya or Maya. Avidya and Maya, the same thing. I mean, ignorance. Maya, often used in a cosmic sense. Avidya, ignorance in an individual sense, but the two terms are interchangeable. Okay? And the surface of the mirror leads to a mistaken attribution of a distinct image to the face. The face, you think your face is dusty and dirty, so you're in illusion. Why are you in illusion? Because the mirror has erroneously, incorrectly, and distortedly reflected your image back to you. So that's the metaphor of Brahman. Sometimes metaphor is it's reflected in many puddles of water with their ripples. So the little tiny suns is captured in each of the puddles, the reflection, but it appears rippled and moving. But in actual fact, the sun isn't. Why does it appear that way? Because it's the medium of the water reflects it that way. So therefore, Advaita Vedanta says Maya, illusion. Maya, also known as avidya. It's been written in the text, so you have the spelling there. Maya and avidya, and you have it in the index, page 89, if you want to know how to spell that. And Maya is also there, page 90. Okay, so for these, if you're having a problem with the spelling, it's in everything I've said is actually in the text, but have a look at the glossary as well. Okay, so Maya, M-A-Y-A, is the same as avidya, A-V-I-D-Y-A, ignorance. They both mean ignorance. So Brahman, reflected in ignorance, appears to imagine itself, it distorts itself into the things of the world and the living entities of the world. But actually Brahman is pure and unified, and it's only because of the mistaken reflection and the fact that there's a reflective medium, and that's where his opponents are going to come after him. What is the reflective medium? You get the argument. I'll say it one more time. This Maya, is it outside of Brahman? And Brahman, because the mirror is that when I look in a mirror and I see my distorted face, the mirror is outside of me. It's a real medium. It's a real piece of glass on the wall. That's, remember, Śaṅkara just picked holes in Sāṅkhya metaphors, saying your magnet metaphor doesn't work. Your lame and blind man metaphors don't work. Well, his opponent's going to come and say, well, what about your metaphor then of a mirror? How does that work? A mirror is something that's real and it's outside of you. There's a duality between me, the person looking in the mirror, and the mirror itself. There are two things. And Advaita Vedanta doesn't allow two things. So that very metaphor, it's like Śaṅkara says, your metaphor goes against you to Sāṃkhya, metaphor goes against Śaṅkara, the mirror metaphor, because it suggests there's two things, a reflective medium called a mirror, which distorts things, and Brahman, which is gazing into the mirror. So there's no answer for that in the Advaita tradition, no coherent answer that has, it's always been the Achilles heel. Every school has an Achilles heel. We saw the Achilles heel of Sāṃkhya. The Achilles heel of Sāṃkhya is what brings the two together, Prakriti and Purusha, to trigger creation. So, in such a case, the unclean surface of the mirror should be a projected attribute. You project it. You're projecting dirtiness. You think you're dirty because the mirror is projecting that. When I see the oasis, the mirage in the desert, it's not really there. I'm projecting the notion of a lake. It's coming out of my subconscious, and I'm projecting it and superimposing it on the desert. So you get these word upadi, the Sanskrit terms for the superimposition, adyaksha and avarana, and various terms that are classical Advaita metaphysical terms, technical terms, which I won't I won't expect you to You're doing well hanging in there. I won't give you any more Sanskrit at this point. But the face is not really dark complexion, 4 lines on the bottom on page 36. It's not really dark complexion, meaning dusty, right? It's the mirror that's dusty. Nor is the reflection entirely different from the original. At the same time, it's not completely different, the reflection. If I look in the mirror, I'm not seeing, Donald Trump or somebody else, or, Joe Biden, right? I'm seeing myself, but it's just distorted. So the reflection is not entirely different from the original. Not entirely different, but it's not the same either. A dark complexion, meaning dusty, not a racist comment. Remember, the mirror is dusty, and that's what I mean by dark. It's covered by dust, so therefore reflection appears dusty, dark in that sense. A dark complexion is associated with the reflection since it is formed on a dirty mirror. When I see my face now, I think my face is dark because of the dust in the mirror. Devadatta, right? That's just Joe, it's just, the generic person, and anyone, Joe Blow. Was it Jane Dunn? What do they say in the States? They say, for a generic person, is it Jane Dunn or something? Anyway, Joe, Fred Smith in England, that's what we say. So Devadatta is a generic name in Sanskrit. Devadatta is unhappy to see his darkish face in the mirror. But the moment the projected attribute is wiped clean, the mirror is wiped clean, then Devadatta realizes that the original itself has become a reflective image as a mental construction, but his face is fine. He realizes, my face isn't dark with dust, perfectly fine. I just had to wipe the mirror clean. And of course, wiping the mirror clean would be the practice of Advaita Vedanta. The spiritual practices called sadhana of Advaita Vedanta is to cultivate knowledge of the real self. And that's called Jnana Yoga, yoga of knowledge, constantly studying the Upanishads, studying the Vedanta, absorbing the teachings, absorbing them, making the very nature of the mind, because the mind is nothing other than what we put into it. It's like a net of imprints. Nature of the mind is that. And so you can change the mind. Mind is just a net, and you change what you put into it. And so Jnana Yoga says, okay, instead of watching TV or reading rubbish or just hanging out and chit-chatting about nothing, you study intensely the teachings of the Vedanta and the Upanishads, and all those teachings go into the mind, and they sit in the mind. Where do our desires come from? You desire something. You hear there's a new Ben and Jerry ice cream. Where does that get? So your mind becomes obsessed with the new Ben and Jerry ice cream. Well, where does it come from? Well, you heard about it, or you saw an advertisement, or you saw it in the shop, and that it becomes imprinted in the mind, and then that starts to control and dominate the mind. That's all desires are like that. They come from the outside, they sit in the mind, and then they start to dominate the mind. And if you have lots of desires, then there's lots of imprints coming in. So what does Jnana Yoga say? Instead of putting that rubbish in, which torments you and never makes you happy, you put the Upanishadic teachings in the mind by constant study, constant meditation on the truths, Shravana, Manana, Nitidhyasana, contemplate them, and your mind becomes those samskaras, right? The imprints called samskaras. We'll be using that. You're seeing that term a lot when we get to yoga. Become the very mind itself. So that's cleaning the mirror. This Jnana Yoga is the process that cleans the mirror, removes the ignorance, removes illusion, my friends. Okay, according to Advaita Vedanta. But he realizes once he's cleaned it that his face is fine. His suffering subsides, and he's freaked out, right? Oh, look, I've got a dusty. My face is dusty. When he cleans the mirror, realizes it was just an illusion. It was the medium of reflection that was at fault, not the face. His suffering subsides when he's cleaned it. Since he knows my face is not dusty or darkish, the living being being delimited by spiritual ignorance as its main condition, right? We're all in ignorance that we're Atman, that we're Brahman, and we're all thinking, I am, Hindu, I'm American, I'm British, I'm black, I'm white, I'm male, I'm female. It's not what we really are. According to any of these traditions, we're really Atman. They say they all accept that. I mean, they're arguing about whether there's an Ishvara or not, but everyone accepts that we're ultimately Atman in our deep innermost self. These moksha traditions the Hindu ones anyway, the Vedic ones will accept. The ordinary self suffers due to its identification with words, ideas, and so on as mentally cognized. So we think there's a real world out there. We see it, and then those imprints come into our mind, and we assign name to it. We say, okay, we'll call this a cup, we'll call that a tree, we'll call this a bottle. So these world out there, which is false, but because of the reflection, it's actually a reflection in Maya. Really, there's just Brahman. But this Maya, where in the metaphor of the mirror in the object of comparison is Maya. Consciousness sees Maya, distorted into the things of this world, right? Like the dust on the mirror. So that's the things of this world, the trees and the universes and skies, and all of that is just imaginary creation on Maya. And then the conscious perceives it. It has imagined instruments of perception, because even the body is imagined. It's not really real. The mind is not really real. It's quite a lot. It's hard work to defend this, by the way. But Śaṅkara is a brilliant theologian, and he's one of the great thinkers of ancient India. World gets imprinted in our mind, and we say, okay, what's this? And we get together. We say, let's call it a cup. Okay, what about this? Or we'll call it a. Well, actually, we don't get together because they would say words are eternal. So that's not quite right. But with these imprints, then, names are assigned to them. Okay, that's what he's saying here. So the ordinary self suffers due to its identification with words, these objects. We identify with objects, which we then give words to. And then ideas. We put ideas together like, oh, if I had that, I could be happy. Or even intellectual ideas, and so forth. And so on as mentally cognized. They're all mental cognitions. As a metaphysical truth, no suffering belongs to the Supreme Self. Because ultimately there's only Brahman. There is no reflection of the world in Maya. Now, what is Maya? That Śaṅkara or no Advaitin can really give from the point of view of the other schools, they cannot give a coherent response to that. So the other schools, just as Śaṅkara hammered away at Sāṃkhya, maybe not so much Sāṃkhya, but the other Vaishnava schools will hammer away at Śaṅkara and say, well, what is this Maya that is the reflective medium of ignorance, like the mirror? Let's finish up. Oh, maybe we did use up most of our time. Look, it's 1 hour and 7 minutes. Immediate awareness of Brahman, the self, arises due to a mature and intense practice of meditation on what? On the teaching that thou art that, Tattvamasi. Remember the Chandogya. Go check the Chandogya. We might put this in the quiz. The Tattvamasi of the Chandogya, you are that. Remember the rivers merging into the ocean, the bees that take the nectar from the flowers, different nectar, but when they go to the hive, it merges. So it all merges, and then the refrain of those verses in the Chandogya is Tattvamasi, you are that. All this is Brahman, and you are that. Tattvamasi, you are that. You are also Brahman. So what's the method? What's the yogic method for Advaita? Is knowledge. Here it is. The intense practice of meditation on the teachings. Different from Patanjali Yoga Sutra, we're going to find later in the semester. This is Jnana Yoga. What does the mind do in Jnana Yoga? Right? Conventional life. We're in Maya. We run around chasing desires. Vedanta says, no, this causes suffering. Everybody agrees. It causes suffering. How do we get out of suffering? We have to be free of this illusion. How do we get free? For Advaita Vedanta, meditation on the teachings. And he just picks one verse, the Tattvamasi. But he says, like that. On the teaching, but others, it's not just that one verse. Having learned it from scripture, where do the teachings come from? The scripture, with the Upanishads. And having reflected on it, that's manana. So you hear it, shravana, you hear the teachings, most of that will be heard. You reflect on them, you deeply engage them, you apply intellectuality, you bring in that's what the whole idea of bringing in opposing points of view so that you can test your own school's view. And see if it holds against the Sāṅkhya challenge and the Buddhist challenge and the other challenges. And that's the whole point of bringing in the opposing point of view, is to firm up your own belief, your own sort of conviction that your school's view is correct. So, so then you reflect on it in a mature and intense way, not dogmatic. Again, that's why the opposing point of view is brought in, precisely to avoid this, the school's view being dogmatic. Dogmatic means you just assert things and you don't want to argue. You're not going to engage critical reasoning. You just assert it and that's it. Oh, it says it in my sacred text and that's it. I'm not going to argue. I don't want to hear any contrary views. Not like that. Reflect on it in a mature way. Then the living being becomes aware of the self's true nature. What is the true nature? Not the body, it's not the mind, it's not our gender, it's not our race, not our philosophy. What is it then? True nature, as pure and awakened. Buddha, that's what Buddha means, the awakened one. Buddha, it comes from the Sanskrit root Bud, which means to awaken. The Buddha is the awakened one. Then the living being becomes aware of itself's true nature as pure and awakened, and obstacles along with the subconscious disposition, all the samskaras, remember, all the imprints of the world out there that sit in my mind. And I say, look, there's a tree and it's green. All of that, they disappear because the world wasn't real. When one realizes the world isn't real, then the world sort of dissolves and one's mental awareness and the mental record of the world dissolves, and the very notion of I eventually dissolves. Right? Because there's no I, it's only Brahman. Right? The rivers merge into the ocean. They lose their I-ness, they lose their riverness, they become one with the ocean. The living being becomes aware of the self's true nature as pure and awakened, and obstacles along with the subconscious disposition, the samskaras with a K. Don't confuse that with samsara, the cycle of birth and death without the K. Samskara are the imprints in the mind that make them entrenched, are all wiped away as an entire mass. They all dissolve by the power of Upanishadic knowledge and wisdom. Burns them up like a fire, burns up ignorance in the mind. Eventually, wisdom emerges, and eventually one sees the world as nothing other than pulsating, blissful Brahman. And then there's no more even I. There's no more even sense of I observing the world. It's just all-pervading, infinite, pure, I don't know about pulsating. The Shaktas would say that, another school. But yeah, the Vedanta wouldn't say pulsating. I'll take that back. But Satchidananda, eternal, conscious, blissful experience, essence, that one is now unified with. There's no more one. There is no more fear of transmigration for such a person. You're disconnected from the world, so you don't run around, because karma is when you desire things, and then as soon as you act out of desire, you plant the seed of reaction, then you have to come back and experience the reaction. So when you chase after desire, you're either pious or impious. You either try to obtain it in a righteous way or a non-righteous way. In both cases, you plant a seed of karma. Righteous, if you try to satisfy desires righteously, you get good karma. If you desire to punya, apunya, dharma, dharma, if you try to fulfill desire unrighteously, you get bad karma. But in both cases, you come back. One's got a good birth, one's got a bad birth. You come back, and even a good birth, you still suffer, you still get old, still get frustrated. It's just good relative to somebody else. There's no more fear of transmigration for such a person, because that to which it is due, avidya, is no longer a reality. It's dissolved. The stump and its roots are pulled up. The stump, desire, and its root, the stump is the tree of creation. That's the stump. And the roots are ignorance and ego, the kleshas of Patanjali. Patanjali says they use the language of a root. Avidya, klesha mula, karmashaya, drishta drishta janma vedaniya. Ignorance is the root of samsara, and samsara, the cycle of the reincarnation. Act, generate reactions, and I have to come back to get the reactions. They don't all fit. Some may fit, a few may fit in this one life, so we experience them in this life, but even if we experience them in this life, we respond to them. So then we add another whole layer of reactions. So, but with Jnana Yoga, the Advaita teachings, absorbing the mind in the teachings, that all dissolves. The stump and its roots are pulled up. So that's enough of Vachaspati, and we won't do any more Advaita Vedanta. Now we go on to Ramanuja, who's remember, he accepts a real world, eternally real. He doesn't accept this two-tiered business, that there's only conventional, phenomenal reality and transcendent ultimate reality. The terms in Sanskrit are Paramarthika, ultimate, and Vyavaharika, conventional. Doesn't accept that. Real world, real souls, eternally individual. They don't merge like rivers in the ocean. They're eternal individuals, and there's Brahman is one with them all, supports them all, sustains them, but there are differences. And it's called Vishishta Advaita. He keeps the Advaita because everything is Brahman, but Vishishta, there's differentiation, there's differences within that Brahman. And Brahman is, God is like the soul, like our soul to our body, then God is like the soul to the body, and his body is the world and the soul. So there's two aspects to his body, and he sustains and supports it. And he also has a transcendent aspect as Narayana, Vishnu. And then there's a rich devotional tradition, bhakti tradition, connected to the worship of Vishnu. We get some sense of that at the very end of the semester when we look at Krishna as Ishvara, as God. So then we get really into sort of what does Ishvara really look like in real life Hinduism, in the temples, in the homes of ancient India and modern India. What is that? There's only philosophers are reading this stuff. The tiny, the scholastics, tiny percentage of the population are reading Vedanta sutras and the commentaries. A minuscule portion of the population, both today and in tradition. So what do they really do? Most Hindus, they worship Ishvara. They accept Ishvara, and they worship Ishvara in the form of Krishna and Shiva and Devi and Ram. And we'll look at that a little bit at the end of the semester. So I thought we were going to finish early, but we haven't. It's an hour and 17 minutes. So we're pretty much on schedule, and I'll see you for the next lecture with Ramanuja. Let's hope the weather keeps being as fine as it is, and we can keep recording outside. Otherwise, it would be within a couple of weeks. I'm sure I'll be sitting inside doing these recordings. Have a great evening, day, morning, whatever time it is for you, my friends, and we'll see you again soon.